Introduction: a synopsis of the history of the Semites. Between the giant continents of Asia and Africa lies the Arab Peninsula. Its inhabitants call it the Island of the Arabs because it is separated from the rest of the world on all sides by natural barriers. In the west, it is separated from Africa by the Red Sea. In the east, it is separated by the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman from the Asian mainland. In the south, it is surrounded by the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, while in the north lies that most impenetrable of barriers, vast tracts of desert. In prehistoric times, the land was green and its mountain peaks were snow-capped, but with the receding of the Ice Age, the land began to grow drier and drier and could no longer sustain all its people, so they emigrated from it, in wave after wave, to more fertile climates. The first wave emigrated to Egypt through Bab al-Mandab around 4500 BC, mixed with the Hamitic population of that land, and gave us the ancient Egyptians of history. The second wave emigrated around 4000 BC to the land between the two rivers, now modern Iraq, where they found the Akkadians. They lived under Akkadian rule for some time, and then formed a kingdom of their own, the Kingdom of Babylon. Famous among the Babylonian kings was Hammurabi, who had his laws engraved on a monument of stone. The third wave to appear, though in fact closely akin to the Babylonians, were the Assyrians. They made their mark on history later than the Babylonians and created a military state in which science, medicine, astronomy and mathematics flourished, as well as art and literature. The fourth wave to emigrate were those people that the Greeks called the Phoenicians. They started out around 2000 BC and were the tradesmen and mariners of the ancient world. They built great commercial cities like Sada, Tyre and Sidon. These mariners established colonies all along their trade routes, the most famous among them being the civilization of Carthage. They were the first people to write phonetically and carried their writing everywhere they traded in the ancient world. They taught it to the Greeks, who in turn transmitted it to the Romans. Actually, the oldest phonetic writing yet found is a script discovered in Sinai in the North Arabian tongue. It is considered the link between the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and the writing of the Phoenicians, and dates from 1850 BC. There were also other waves of emigrants, such as the Aramites, who settled near Babylon and established the Chaldean civilization around 2000 BC. In the south, emigrants settled in Abyssinia and established the Old Abyssinian Kingdom, and there were also the Hebrews who settled in Palestine. All these people are called Semites. The word Semite is derived from Sam or Shem, the son of Nuh, alayhi salam. It has no ethnic origin and is a term used for a group of languages found to have certain characteristics in common and to be derived from the same mother tongue or proto-language. These languages are divided into the northern and southern Semitic tongues. The southern tongues are further divided into North Arabian and South Arabian. North Arabian was the language of the people of Mecca and is the tongue that has superseded other Arabian dialects to become known as Classical Arabic, the language honoured by the Quran. South Arabian was the language of the southern peninsula civilizations, Yemen and the lands around it, and the Abyssinian civilization. We shall not record the wars, triumphs and defeats of those who left the peninsula, although they were the oldest civilizations in history, because our main concern is those who remained behind. Geographically, the Arabian Peninsula may be divided into two parts, north and south. Separating these two broad divisions are vast deserts, difficult to penetrate. The people of the north have remained nomadic, for the poor environment of the north does not encourage settled civilization, but forces the inhabitants to be constantly on the move in search of water and pasture. Those of the south were able to establish a succession of advanced civilizations whose ruins of citadels, dams, monuments and palaces 20 stories high bear witness to the prosperity and ability of the people who erected them. It was a purely Arab phenomenon with no external influences and had its own laws, codes, constitution and customs. They had the knowledge and ability to control the heavy rainfall of those parts and store the water by means of dams, barrages and reservoirs. These southern Arabs had trade relations with Syria, Iraq and Egypt. Their caravans crossed the desert, bringing spices, incense, gum and myrrh from India, and returned carrying the goods that these lands produced. The first important South Arabian kingdom was that of the Manians around 1200 BC. It controlled the trade routes and built caravanserais along these routes for their use. The Manians were succeeded by the Sabaeans, who continued the onflow of Arab culture and who inherited the trade routes of the Manians along with their civilization. It was one of the queens of this kingdom, the queen of Saba, Sheba, who went to visit Solomon, alayhi salam. Several causes contributed to the weakening and final ruin of the Sabaean civilization. Among them were their luxurious lifestyle and the neglect of their dams and barrages after they had grown wealthy from trade. In 270 BC, Ptolemy II built a fleet that could ply the Red Sea, which prior to this had been considered unnavigable. This contributed to their decline, since they had previously monopolized trade in the area. Their barrages had been neglected for some time, and when the Dam of Marib broke, their land was flooded and became mostly wasteland, forcing the people to emigrate northwards. Some went to the north of the peninsula in the vicinity of Medina, while others moved right up to the borders of Syria and Iraq, where they formed new kingdoms. The Saba'ians deified their heavenly bodies and worshipped a trinity. The moon, which they called Wud, was their greatest god. The sun was its consort, and a son born of this union, one of the stars, possibly Venus or Jupiter, was the third. It was the Saba'ians penetrating into the north via their trade routes who introduced the worship of the stars to the Arabs of the north. During the 1st century after Christ, Judaism, then Christianity, made their appearance in the land and vied for supremacy over it. This conflict brought in the two great powers that dominated the world at that time, the Roman and the Persian empires. The Himyarite king of Yemen sought the assistance of the Persian Khosrows against his Abyssinian enemies who had overrun his land. In consequence, Yemen remained under Persian influence until the arrival of Islam in the country. In the north, two Arab states emerged. The first was Petra, a city-state built by the Nabateans out of solid rock. This civilization flourished from 300 BC to 106 AD, when the Jewish uprising caused the Roman Emperor Titus to destroy the city and annex the land to the Roman Empire. Another Arab civilization arose soon after Petra's demise in the oasis of Palmyra. It was a trade centre like Petra, powerful and prosperous, and it took a neutral stance in the wars between the Romans and the Persians. It possessed fertile lands and clear crystalline waters. In 42 BC, Mark Antony tried to annex it, but failed, and when in 260 CE the Emperor Gallienus was captured by the Parthians who had invaded Syria, it was the chieftain of Palmyra who rescued the emperor, retrieved Syria, and followed the Parthians right up to their capital, Al-Madain. In the protracted struggle between the Persians and the Romans, the chieftain sided with the Romans and was granted the title of Dux Orientalis, or Emperor of the East. He had power over Asia Minor, Egypt, Syria, and North Arabia. After the death of this chief, his widow ruled on behalf of her son, who was a minor. When the Romans saw her generals reach as far as Alexandria and Ankara, they revoked their treaty with the state, destroyed the city, and carried the proud Arab queen in chains to Rome. Her story has entered into Arabic verse and legend as the story of Az-Zawba'i, or in Latin, Zenobia. After the destruction of their civilization, the Nabateans were merged among the Arab tribes of the north. The Arabs tended to build their cities further from the border and from the influence of foreign powers. Mecca and the Kaaba. About 80 kilometres from the coast in the eastern mountain chain, surrounded by mountains on all sides except for 3 narrow passes, stood Mecca. It was on the caravan route of the tribes, but, having no water or plant life, was deserted except for an occasional passer-by. In this secluded place, where not even a fly could live, Ibrahim a.s. was ordered to leave Hajar, his Egyptian wife, and her young son Ismail, for in this valley, where nothing could grow, Allah wanted men to go for the express purpose of worship and wanted the progeny of Ibrahim a.s. to cater to the needs of the worshippers. When the provisions Ibrahim a.s. had left them ran out, Hajar looked around for a way of obtaining food and water, for her little son was beginning to suffer from thirst. She could find nothing at all, so she went back and forth, scanning the horizon, hurrying between 2 prominences called As-Safa and Al-Marwa in order to see as far as possible. Back and forth she went 7 times, and when she returned to see how her son was faring, the child was kicking the earth, and from under his foot water gushed out. Hajar remained with her son in the secluded valley surrounded by mountains. She began to give the passing tribes water in exchange for whatever she needed. The first tribe to be attracted to the waters of Zamzam were Banu Jurhum. Hajar allowed them to settle near her on condition that the water remained in her custody. When Ismail grew up, he married a girl from this tribe. On his travels, Ibrahim a.s. used to visit his son. On one of these visits, he was instructed to build a house of worship for Allah that would be a sanctuary for the worshipper, and so together Ibrahim a.s. and Ismail a.s. built the first house for the worship of Allah on earth. They taught the people of those parts to worship one deity, Allah alone, unswervingly. To this day, Muslims pray in the place where Ibrahim a.s. instructed the people at the ancient or sacred house, or the Kaaba as it is called. With the passage of the centuries, the Meccans grew rich and influential through trade. They began to live a life of luxury and had neglected to draw out enough water from Zamzam, the name of Hajar's spring, to irrigate the land or attend to their stock. They also began to forget the teaching of Ibrahim a.s. and Ismail a.s., and when Zamzam started to dry up, they began to grow weaker. One of their great men, Al-Mudad ibn Amr of Jurhum, tried to warn them of the consequences, but they would not listen to him. He knew that power would soon go out of their hands, so he took 2 gold statues in the form of gazelles and the money that was inside the Kaaba, lowered them deep down into the well of Zamzam and covered it so that no one would know the place. Soon after, he left Mecca with the descendants of Ismail a.s. The tribe of Khuza', who had vied with Banu Jurhum for the honour of guarding the sacred house, ousted them and took over. They passed on the honorary offices associated with the guardianship for generation after generation, and it is believed that they had a hand in introducing idol worship in Mecca. The Sabaeans, who were star worshippers, also influenced the Meccans in this. Power remained in the hands of the Khuza'a until the time of Qusay ibn Kilab, the great-great-great-great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He was known among his people for his good sense and judgment, and his trade prospered and his sons increased. The tribe of Quraysh, the descendants of Ismail a.s., rallied around him. The honorary offices of the Kaaba were still in the hands of Khuza'a. Qusay had married a girl from this tribe, and before her father died he had entrusted the keys of the Kaaba to her, but being a woman she apologized and handed them to another man from her tribe called Abu Gubshan. Abu Gubshan was a man who liked to drink, and one day, possibly when intoxicated, he sold the keys of the Kaaba to Qusay for a chalice of wine. When Khuza'a saw that the honorary officers of the Kaaba had fallen into the hands of Qusay, they decided to fight him for them, but all the Meccans, who held Qusay in high esteem, rallied to him against Khuza'a, and drove them out of Mecca and made Qusay their king. Then all the officers of catering to the pilgrims, held to be the greatest of honours, became Qusay's by right. He was the first to make hospitality to the pilgrims the duty of the Meccans. Thus he addressed his people, "People of Quraysh, you are the neighbours of Allah and the people of his house and his holy precincts. The pilgrims are the guests of Allah, the visitors to his house. Of all guests they are the most worthy of your hospitality, so prepare food and drink for them on the days of pilgrimage until they leave the land." In those days when there were no hotels and few shops, the traveller relied solely on the hospitality of the people of the land. Hospitality to the stranger was one of the sacred duties, indeed the supreme duty, of the Arabs who lived in an environment where a man could perish from thirst and hunger if help was not forthcoming. After Qusay, the honorary officers of catering to the pilgrims were divided among his sons and subsequently their progeny. Hashim was the most capable of his brothers and, like his grandfather Qusay, he called the Meccans to prepare food and drink for the pilgrims. He felt responsible for the people of Mecca, and in years of scarcity he used to feed and care for the needy. On a trip to Medina, then known as Yathrib, he met a striking woman who was managing her trade and taking charge of her dependents. He admired her greatly and asked for her hand in marriage. Knowing his position among his people, she accepted. Her name was Salma, and she was from the tribe of Al-Khazraj. This union produced a child whose maternal uncles were Medinans and whose paternal uncles were Meccans. His name was Shayba. Abdul Muttalib. Hashim died on one of his trading trips to Gaza. His brother Al-Muttalib became the head of the tribe. One day he thought of his little nephew living with his mother in Yathrib and decided that it was time that he should live with his father's people in Mecca. So he went to Yathrib and brought the boy back with him to Mecca. People, seeing him approaching with a young boy riding behind him, thought it was a new slave he had bought and called the boy Abdul Muttalib, or slave of Al-Muttalib. When they learnt that this was his nephew, the son of Hashim, they still held to that first name, continuing to call him Abdul Muttalib instead of Shayba. Al-Muttalib wanted to give his nephew the money that belonged to Hashim, his father, but another uncle, Nawfal, had seized it and would not allow him to have it. When Abdul Muttalib grew older, he called his uncles from Yathrib to his aid. 80 horsemen came to Mecca to assist their young cousin so that Nawfal was forced to deliver his father's money to him. Abdul Muttalib inherited the positions that his father Hashim used to occupy, which were welcoming the pilgrims and giving them water. But finding water for the pilgrims was a task of great hardship for him, as he had only one son to aid him and it needed many men to carry the water and bring it from distant places. All the Meccans remembered nostalgically the water source of Zamzam, but Abdul Muttalib thought of it as a cherished dream. It would make his task of providing the pilgrims with water so much easier. In his sleep he would dream over and over again of this well and of someone telling him to reopen it. He kept looking for it until at last he was inspired to search between two of the idols placed near the Kaaba. There he dug, and water gushed out. He kept on digging until the two golden gazelles, the money, and the swords of his ancestor Mudad were revealed. Quraysh wanted him to share the treasure with them, but he refused. Then, reconsidering, he offered to draw lots with them for it. The Meccans used to draw lots by writing their names on arrows, then casting them inside the Kaaba in a particular place so that the decision would be that of their gods. According to this lottery, Abdul Muttalib was to keep the swords and the statues were to go to the Kaaba. Abdul Muttalib placed the gazelles at the door of the Kaaba, and he also placed the swords there as a decoration. Abdul Muttalib was the immediate paternal grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Thousands of years earlier, Ibrahim a.s. had prayed to Allah that he might provide for those of his descendants that remained in the desolate valley of Mecca, and to send them a messenger from amongst themselves to guide them to the straight way. Consequently, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used to say, "I came in answer to the prayer of my grandfather Ibrahim."